This video contains a fictional story created for entertainment and inspiration. The narrative is origined, created with the assistance of AI tools and human creative review, no real events or historical facts being presented as true. Albert Benfer had learned early in life that his title preceded him like a shadow, long and inescapable. The Duke of Benfort carried a name that opened doors, commanded respect, and built walls between himself and the truth of human nature. At 32, he had mastered the art of reading people's intentions, recognizing the practiced smiles of those who sought his favor, the calculated kindness of women hoping to become his duchess, and the hollow friendships of men who valued his connections more than his character. The estate stretched across rolling hills and ancient forests, a testament to generations of accumulated wealth and influence. Servants moved through marble corridors with practiced efficiency, tending to needs Albert rarely voiced. His childhood had been one of tutors and expectations, of learning to carry the weight of a duchy before he understood the cost of such privilege. His father, stern and distant, had taught him that duty mattered more than happiness, that the continuation of their line required strategic marriage, not romantic folly. Albert had accepted this reality for years, attending balls where mothers paraded their daughters like prized horses, engaging in conversations that never moved beyond pleasantries and politics. He had grown accustomed to loneliness, wearing it like a second coat of arms. But acceptance did not equal contentment, and in the quiet hours before dawn, when the estate lay silent, he sometimes wondered if he would ever experience the kind of connection the poets wrote about. The morning of the encounter began like any other. Albert had risen early, restless energy driving him from his chambers. The estate felt particularly suffocating that day, the walls pressing in with their weight of history and obligation. He decided to ride out to the farthest boundaries of his land, areas he rarely visited, where tenant farms dotted the landscape and life moved at a different pace. His stallion, a magnificent black creature named Midnight, carried him through familiar woods and into territory that felt almost foreign despite belonging to his family for centuries. The sun climbed higher, warming the spring air, and Albert found himself slowing as he approached a modest farm tucked into a valley between gentle hills. The property was small but well maintained, the kind of place that spoke of honest labor and careful stewardship. A stone cottage with a thatched roof sat at the center, smoke rising from its chimney. Fields surrounded it, some recently tilled, others showing the first green shoots of new crops. A small barn stood to one side, and chickens pecked at the ground near a wooden fence. What caught Albert's attention was not the farm itself, but the family working in the field. A man, perhaps 50 years of age, guided a plough pulled by an aging horse. Two younger men worked alongside him, their movements synchronized by years of shared labor. And then there was the young woman carrying a wooden bucket, her simple dress practical rather than fashionable, her dark hair pulled back from a face that stopped Albert's breath. She moved with purpose, bringing water to the men, speaking words Albert couldn't hear, but could read in the affection of their responses. There was something in the way she held herself, a quiet dignity that had nothing to do with birth or breeding, and everything to do with character. She laughed at something her father said, the sound carrying across the field like music, and Albert felt something shift in his chest. Beauty he had seen before in countless forms and fashions. The ballrooms of London overflowed with it, carefully cultivated and displayed. But this was different. This was beauty unaware of itself, natural as sunlight, unadorned and therefore more striking than any jeweled gown or powdered face. The way she moved spoke of strength earned through labor, grace born of confidence rather than training. Albert didn't realize he had stopped his horse until Midnight shifted beneath him, impatient to continue. He sat frozen, watching this scene of simple domestic harmony, feeling like an intruder witnessing something sacred. The young woman glanced up then, perhaps sensing observation, and their eyes met across the distance. Even from that far, Albert felt the impact of her gaze. There was no recognition in it, no calculation or practiced flirtation. She looked at him, the way one might regard any stranger passing by, with mild curiosity and no particular interest. Then she turned back to her family, and Albert was left with the unsettling realization that for the first time in years, someone had looked at him and seen nothing of consequence. The moment should have been insignificant. A duke riding past a tenant farm, glimpsing people whose names he didn't know and lives he would never touch. Albert had passed hundreds of such farms, seen thousands of such people, but something about this woman, this family, this scene, refused to release him. He continued his ride, completing the circuit of his land, but his thoughts kept returning to that valley, that cottage, that face. By the time he returned to the estate, evening shadows stretched across the manicured lawns. Albert dismounted and handed midnight's reins to a waiting groom, his mind still occupied with images of a simple farm and a woman carrying water. He entered his study, a room lined with leather-bound books and expensive furnishings, and poured himself a glass of brandy he didn't really want. Thomas Whitmore had served the Benford family for 30 years, beginning as a footman and rising to become Albert's most trusted servant and, in truth, his only real friend. The older man entered the study without knocking, a privilege earned through decades of loyalty and discretion. He took one look at Albert's face and raised an eyebrow. "You have the expression of a man who's seen a ghost, Your Grace." Albert set down his glass. "Not a ghost, Thomas, something far more troubling." "Shall I summon the physician?" "The physician cannot cure what ails me." Albert moved to the window, looking out at grounds that suddenly felt like a prison. "I saw a woman today." Thomas waited, understanding that more would come. "A tenant farmer's daughter, I presume, working in the fields with her family. Nothing remarkable about the situation, and yet—" Albert turned from the window. "I cannot stop thinking about her." "Women of that station are not for dukes, Your Grace," Thomas said carefully. "The scandal alone—" "I know what's expected of me. I've known my entire life." Albert's voice held an edge of frustration he rarely allowed himself. An advantageous marriage to a woman of appropriate rank, children to secure the line, a life of duty and display. He paused. "But what if there's more to life than what's expected? What if those poets and storytellers aren't entirely wrong about love?" Thomas studied his master with concern. "What are you contemplating?" "I need to know more about that family. The farm in the Eastern Valley where the land slopes toward Miller's Creek. Find out who they are, their circumstances, everything." "And then?" Albert smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his usually solemn features. "Then I'll decide how much of my life I'm willing to surrender to duty and how much I'm willing to fight for myself." Thomas left to make discreet inquiries, and Albert spent the evening pacing his study, unable to settle. He tried reading, but the words blurred. He attempted correspondence but couldn't focus. Finally, he stood again at the window, watching the moon rise over his land, and admitted to himself what he'd known since the moment their eyes met. He was in love. Impossibly, impractically, completely in love with a woman whose name he didn't even know. 2 days later, Thomas returned with information gathered through careful questioning of estate managers and local merchants. The family was named Belrose, honest people who had farmed that land for 3 generations. The father, William, was known for his integrity and kindness. The 2 sons, Matthew and James, were hard-working and respected, and the daughter was Catherine, 24 years old, unmarried, and according to those who knew her, as kind as she was beautiful. But there was more, and Thomas's expression grew grave as he relayed it. The Belrose family was drowning in debt, not through any fault of their own, but through the machinations of a previous landlord who had imposed unfair terms before the property came under Benford management. They struggled to meet their obligations while maintaining their pride and dignity, refusing charity they saw as shameful. Albert listened to every detail, his mind working through possibilities and problems. He could solve their financial difficulties with a word, a simple forgiveness of debt that would mean nothing to his fortune and everything to their future. But such an act would brand him immediately as the Duke, and the girl would look at him differently, see him through the lens of gratitude and obligation rather than genuine regard. "I want to meet her," Albert said finally. "To know her, without the burden of my title between us." Thomas frowned. "Your Grace, that's impossible. You're known throughout the county." "Not in the valleys and farms, I'm not. How many of my tenants have actually seen my face? I review accounts in my study, delegate inspections to managers. The common people know the name Benford, but not the man who carries it." Albert's excitement built as the idea took shape. I could be anyone, Thomas. A man seeking work, temporary help during planting season. This is madness. Perhaps, but it's my madness, and for once in my life, I'm going to choose something for myself rather than accept what's chosen for me. Albert moved to his desk, pulling out paper. Help me, Thomas. Help me become someone else just for a while. Help me discover if love can exist without title or fortune clouding it. Thomas shook his head, but Albert saw the understanding in his eyes. The old servant had watched him grow up in a gilded cage, had witnessed the loneliness that wealth and position couldn't cure. If anyone understood Albert's need for something real, it was Thomas. You'll need to look the part, Thomas said slowly. Rough clothes, work-hardened hands, and your manner of speaking, Your Grace, it marks you as educated. I'll learn. I'll adapt. Albert felt more alive than he had in years. Find me what I need, Thomas. Clothes, a background story, everything necessary to become someone ordinary. Over the next week, they prepared. Albert acquired rough homespun clothing, broke in work boots until they looked properly worn, and practiced speaking in the simpler patterns of common folk. He invented a history for himself, a man from a distant county seeking work after his previous position ended. Not too much detail to trip over, but enough to satisfy casual questions. Thomas arranged for discreet purchases of simple necessities, things a laborer might carry. Albert studied the rhythms of farm work, consulted with his estate's farmers about the seasonal demands, and learned what would be expected of someone seeking employment at a small holding like the Belrose farm. The transformation was remarkable. Without his fine clothes and aristocratic bearing, Albert looked like any number of men who worked the land. His hands, unused to real labor, would betray him at first, but that could be explained by recent illness or easier work. The key was to approach with humility, to offer help rather than demand employment. The morning Albert set out felt momentous. He left the estate before dawn, dressed in his common clothes, carrying a small pack of basic possessions. Thomas had arranged for him to stay at a cottage on the far edge of Benford land, a place where he could retreat when not at the Belrose farm, where he could be himself in private before donning his disguise again. As he walked toward the valley, the sun rising behind him, Albert felt fear and anticipation in equal measure. What if she saw through his deception immediately? What if her father turned him away? What if he discovered that the connection he felt was one-sided, a product of loneliness rather than genuine compatibility? But he kept walking, because the alternative, returning to his life without knowing, was worse than any possible rejection. The cottage came into view as morning light painted the valley in gold. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating the family was awake and beginning their day. Albert paused at the edge of the property, taking a deep breath. This was the moment that would change everything. He could still turn back, return to the safety of his title and position, forget this foolish dream. Instead, he stepped forward. William Belrose was mending a section of fence when Albert approached, calling out a greeting to avoid startling him. The older man looked up, his weathered face showing curiosity rather than suspicion. "Good morning," Albert said, keeping his voice casual, friendly. "I'm looking for work and I heard you might need an extra hand during planting season." William set down his tools, studying the stranger before him. Albert met his gaze steadily, letting the older man take his measure. There was kindness in William's eyes, but also the weariness of a man carrying burdens he couldn't share. "Times are hard," William said finally. "I can't pay much." "I don't need much. Just honest work and perhaps a meal or two. I'm good with my hands and willing to learn what I don't know." Catherine emerged from the cottage then, carrying a basket toward the chicken coop. She glanced at the stranger speaking with her father, and once again Albert felt that jolt of recognition, that sense of meeting someone profoundly important. She didn't recognize him from their distant sighting days before, seeing only a laborer seeking employment. William called her over. "Catherine, what do you think? Could we use another pair of hands?" She approached, and Albert was struck again by her natural grace, the intelligence in her eyes as she assessed him. "What's your name, stranger?" "Albert," he said, using his first name while dropping his family name. "Albert Hayes." Hayes was his mother's maiden name, a small truth within the larger deception. "You look strong enough," Catherine said practically, "but our situation is complicated. We can't promise steady work or good wages." "I understand difficult situations," Albert replied, meaning it more than she could know. "Sometimes what matters isn't the wages but the company you keep while working." William made his decision. "You can start today. We're clearing the north field. If you work well, we'll see about tomorrow." And just like that, Albert stepped into a new life. He worked alongside William and his sons throughout that first day, feeling muscles protest labor they'd never performed. His hands, soft from a life of privilege, blistered quickly. But he didn't complain, pushing through the discomfort, learning the rhythm of honest toil. Catherine brought water and food during breaks, her presence a reward for his aching body. She spoke little at first, observing him with the caution of someone who had learned not to trust too quickly. But as days turned to weeks, and Albert proved himself reliable and hard-working, her manner softened. He learned the shape of their days, the routines that governed life on a small farm. Early mornings began with feeding animals and collecting eggs. Days progressed through planting, mending, building, and 100 other tasks. Evenings brought simple meals around a worn table, conversation that felt more valuable than any he'd experienced in aristocratic drawing rooms. The Belrose family welcomed him gradually, not with grand gestures, but through small inclusions, an invitation to share their midday meal, a question about his thoughts on crop rotation. Catherine's smile when he managed a task particularly well. These moments felt more precious than all the formal dinners and elaborate balls he'd attended. Albert discovered the truth of manual labor, the satisfaction of seeing direct results from effort invested. He planted seeds, repaired fences, helped birth a calf when complications arose. His hands grew calloused, his back stronger. The physical transformation mirrored something deeper, a stripping away of pretense until he felt more himself than he had in years. Catherine began speaking to him more freely, sharing stories of her childhood, her dreams for the farm, her hopes that someday they might be free of the debts that haunted her father's sleep. Albert listened, biting back offers of help that would reveal his true identity. Instead, he worked harder, trying to lighten their burden through labor, if not gold. He noticed everything about her, the way she hummed while working, the patience she showed teaching him new tasks, the love evident in every interaction with her family. She was educated beyond what he expected, having learned to read from a traveling teacher years ago. Books were precious in their household, read and reread until the pages wore soft. One evening, as they sat outside after supper, Catherine asked him about his past. Albert offered the carefully constructed story, but found himself including truths within the fiction. His loneliness, though he attributed it to different circumstances, his sense that life should offer more than mere survival, his belief that genuine connection mattered more than material success. "You're an odd sort of laborer," Catherine said, a smile playing at her lips. "You speak better than most, think deeper than expected." Albert's heart raced, fearing discovery. "My mother valued education. She taught me what she could." "She raised you well, then?" Catherine's expression grew wistful. "Sometimes I wonder what life might have been like if circumstances were different, if we didn't carry this debt, if we had freedom to choose our paths." "What would you choose?" Albert asked softly. She looked at the stars emerging in the darkening sky. "Something beautiful, something true. I'd want to love freely, without worrying that my choice might burden those I care for. I'd want partnership, not transaction." She turned to him. "What about you, Albert Hayes? What would you choose if you could have anything?" He looked at her. This woman who held his heart without knowing it and spoke truth. This, exactly this. Honest work, good people, and the possibility of something real. As spring progressed into early summer, Albert felt himself falling deeper. Every shared laugh, every accidental touch while working, every moment of understanding built foundations he knew would last. He was no longer pretending to be someone else. He had become the man he played, or perhaps discovered the man he'd always been beneath the title. But the deception weighed on him. Every day without revealing the truth felt like another small betrayal. He loved Catherine, truly and completely. But she loved Albert Hayes, a common labourer. What would happen when she learned about Albert Benfoot, Duke of a great estate, owner of the very land she worked? Thomas visited occasionally, bringing supplies and checking on his master. "You're happier than I've ever seen you," he observed during one such visit. "But this cannot continue indefinitely, Your Grace." "I know," Albert admitted, "but I'm not ready to let it end, not yet." "And when you do reveal yourself, what then?" Albert had no answer. He could only hope that what they were building was strong enough to survive the truth, that Catherine would understand why he'd done this, would forgive the deception, would choose him not despite his title, but because of who he truly was beneath it. The moment of decision approached faster than he wanted. William's oldest debt was coming due, a payment impossible to make. Albert overheard the older man talking with his sons late one night, the desperation clear. They discussed selling equipment, letting fields lie fallow, desperate measures that would only deepen their problems. Albert knew he could end this with a word. As Duke, he could forgive every debt, secure their future, ensure they never worried again. But doing so would end the dream, would transform whatever existed between him and Catherine into something tainted by gratitude and obligation. Yet how could he stand by and watch them suffer when he had the power to help? What kind of man possessed the means to solve every problem but chose his own desires over their welfare? The internal battle raged as Albert lay awake in his cottage that night. He had come seeking true love, connection untainted by his position. He had found it, found her, found a life that felt more authentic than anything he'd known. But that authenticity was built on lies, and those lies were becoming unbearable. Catherine deserved to know who he was. Her family deserved the help he could provide. The question was whether he could offer both without destroying what they'd built. As dawn broke on what would become the most important day of his life, Albert made his decision. He would ask for Catherine's hand in marriage, but he would do it as Albert Hayes, the labourer she had come to know, and perhaps to love. If she accepted, if she chose him when she believed him to be nobody, then he would know the truth of her heart. Only then would he reveal everything: his identity, his ability to help her family, his desire to make her his duchess. It was a risk that could cost him everything. But love, real love, was worth the gamble. And as he dressed and prepared to walk to the Belrose farm for another day of honest labour and quiet courtship, Albert felt more certain than he had about anything in his privileged life. Today, he would discover whether a duke could be loved simply as a man, and whether the woman he adored could see past deception to the genuine heart beneath. My dear friends and listeners, before we continue, I want to be honest with you. At the moment, YouTube does not consider this type of content relevant for monetization. Even so, this channel continues because I truly believe in these stories and in the connection we share here. If you would like this channel to continue and keep accompanying these stories, in the video description and in the pinned comment, there is a support link. You can support by buying an ebook or contributing in another way. Any help is deeply appreciated at this time. Thank you for being here and for supporting this work in any way you can. Now, let's continue our story. The morning air carried the scent of honeysuckle and fresh earth as Albert walked toward the Belrose farm. 3 months had passed since he first knocked on their door seeking work. 3 months of transformation that went deeper than calloused hands and sun-darkened skin. He had become part of their rhythm, woven into the fabric of their daily lives so completely that sometimes he forgot the deception at the heart of it all. But today, that deception would either end or evolve into something more complex. Today, he would ask Catherine to be his wife, and the answer she gave would determine everything that followed. He found her in the garden, tending vegetables with the practiced care she brought to all her tasks. Morning light caught in her hair, turning ordinary brown to burnished copper. She looked up at his approach, and the smile that crossed her face made his chest tighten. That smile had become his favorite sight in the world, unrehearsed and genuine, given freely because she wanted to, not because his title demanded it. "You're early," she said, brushing dirt from her hands. "Father and the boys are still at breakfast." "I didn't come to work today." Albert's voice sounded steadier than he felt. "I came to speak with you." Something in his tone made her straighten, curiosity mixing with concern in her expression. "Is something wrong?" "No, at least, I hope not." He stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of green in her brown eyes, close enough to smell the lavender soap she used. "Catherine, these past months working here, getting to know you and your family, have been the best of my life." Her cheeks colored slightly. "You've become important to us too. Father says you work harder than men half your age, and the boys consider you a friend." "And you?" Albert asked softly. "What do you consider me?" Catherine met his gaze directly, never one to shy from honest conversation. "I consider you someone I've come to care for, someone whose presence I look forward to each morning, and whose absence I notice each evening when you leave." His heart raced. "Then perhaps you'll consider what I'm about to ask." He took her hands, feeling the roughness that matched his own now, the evidence of shared labor. "I know I have little to offer. No land, no fortune, just these hands and the willingness to work them to the bone for those I love. But I'm asking anyway, because I cannot imagine my future without you in it." Catherine's eyes widened, understanding dawning. "Marry me," Albert said, the words carrying every ounce of sincerity he possessed. "Let me spend my life proving that a man doesn't need wealth to treasure his wife, doesn't need status to honor and cherish the woman he loves. I can't promise you luxury, but I can promise you my whole heart every day for the rest of our lives." Silence stretched between them, and Albert felt the weight of worlds hanging in balance. This was the moment of truth, the test of whether love could exist independent of all the trappings he'd been taught were essential. Catherine's hands trembled in his, and he saw tears gathering in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. Then stronger. "Yes, Albert Hayes. I'll marry you." Relief and joy flooded through him so intensely he felt dizzy. He pulled her close, holding her as if she might disappear if he let go. She fit against him perfectly, her head tucked beneath his chin, her arms wrapped around his waist. They stood like that in the garden, two people from vastly different worlds who had somehow found each other despite everything designed to keep them apart. When they finally pulled back, both were laughing and crying at once. Catherine touched his face with gentle fingers. "I love you. I didn't plan to, didn't think I should given our circumstances, but I do. You're good and kind and real in ways I didn't know existed." "I love you too," Albert said, and meant it more than anything he'd ever said, more than I can express. They told her family together, walking hand in hand into the cottage where William and his sons were finishing breakfast. The older man looked up, saw their joined hands and radiant faces, and his weathered features softened into a smile. "I was wondering when you'd work up the courage," William said, standing to embrace them both. "Took you long enough." Matthew and James congratulated them with backslapping enthusiasm, already planning a celebration despite their limited means. The cottage filled with excited chatter about dates and preparations, humble plans that carried more warmth than the grandest society wedding Albert had ever attended. They decided to marry quickly, seeing no reason to wait. Catherine had no elaborate gown to prepare, needed no months of planning for an event that would be witnessed by a handful of people rather than hundreds. 2 weeks, they agreed, would give them time to make basic arrangements while not postponing the start of their life together. Those 2 weeks passed in a blur of happiness and growing anxiety. Albert worked alongside his future family, helped Catherine prepare the cottage that would become their home, a small dwelling on Belrose land that William had offered them. He participated in every discussion, every decision, while guilt gnawed at him constantly. He was stealing moments that belonged to truth, building a foundation on deception, even as he promised honesty. Several times, he nearly confessed everything, the words forming on his tongue before fear swallowed them. What if she refused to marry him once she knew? What if she felt manipulated, her feelings tainted by the knowledge that he'd been lying from their first meeting? Thomas visited in secret, bringing supplies Albert claimed to have saved from previous work. The old servant looked increasingly troubled by the situation. "Your Grace, you cannot let her marry you without knowing who you are. It's not fair to her." "I know," Albert admitted, pacing the small cottage he'd been using. "But I'm terrified, Thomas. If I tell her now and she walks away, I'll have lost the only real thing I've ever had." "And if you tell her after the wedding, what then?" "Then she'll be my wife, bound to me, and I'll have time to make her understand why I did this." Albert heard the desperation in his own voice. "I'll tell her immediately after we're married. Before we even consummate the union, she'll know everything." Thomas shook his head sadly. "I hope you know what you're doing, Your Grace." Albert didn't know. He only knew he couldn't stop now, couldn't turn back from the path he'd chosen. Right or wrong, he was committed to seeing it through to whatever end awaited. The wedding day arrived with cloudless skies and birdsong. Catherine wore a simple dress of cream muslin, her hair woven with wildflowers Matthew and James had gathered. She looked more beautiful than any duchess in silk and diamonds. Albert wore his best rough clothes clean and mended, transformed by happiness into something that felt almost fine. They married in the small village church, the same church where Belrose family members had been married for generations. The vicar, an elderly man who'd known Catherine since birth, performed the ceremony with gentle warmth. William gave his daughter away with tears in his eyes. Matthew and James stood as witnesses, and a handful of neighbors filled the pews to witness this union of two people everyone believed matched in station and circumstance. Albert spoke his vows with complete sincerity, promising to love and honor this woman for all his days. When Catherine repeated her own vows, her voice clear and strong, he felt the weight of responsibility settle over him like a mantle. She was his now and he was hers, regardless of what revelations were still to come. They kissed to seal their marriage, and the small congregation erupted in applause. The celebration that followed was humble but heartfelt, held in the Belrose cottage yard with simple food and homemade wine. Neighbors brought what they could spare, turning the gathering into a feast of community and goodwill. Music played on a fiddle, and couples danced on grass worn smooth by many feet. Albert danced with his bride, holding her close, memorizing every detail of this moment. Catherine laughed with pure joy, her face luminous, her trust in him absolute. The guilt he felt became almost unbearable. She had given herself to him completely, believing she knew who he was, and he was about to shatter that belief. As evening approached and guests began departing, Catherine turned to him with shy anticipation. "Shall we go to our cottage?" "Soon," Albert said, his throat tight. "But first I need to speak with you and your family. Something important that can't wait any longer." Concern flickered across her face. "What is it?" "Please, just gather your father and brothers. This involves all of you." They assembled in the main cottage, the four Belroses looking at Albert with various degrees of curiosity and concern. Catherine sat beside him, her hand in his, offering comfort she didn't know he desperately needed. He had rehearsed this moment 100 times, but now that it arrived, all his prepared words fled. "I haven't been honest with you," he began, his voice rough. "From the moment I came here seeking work, I've been living a lie." William frowned. "What kind of lie?" Albert stood, unable to remain seated for what came next. "My name is Albert Hayes, but it's also Albert Benford, Duke of Benford. This land you farm, this cottage you live in, the debts that burden you, all of it falls under my authority." The silence that followed was absolute. Catherine's hand went slack in his, and when he looked at her, he saw incomprehension transforming into shock. "You're lying," she whispered. "This is some kind of cruel joke." "I wish it were." Albert pulled documents from his jacket, papers Thomas had provided, proving his identity. "I saw you 3 months ago while riding through my lands. I saw you and fell in love immediately, completely. But I knew that if I approached you as Duke Benford, I would never know if your feelings were genuine or influenced by my position." William examined the documents with shaking hands, his face growing pale as he recognized official seals and signatures. "Dear God, it's true." "I wanted you to know me," Albert continued, looking at Catherine even as she refused to meet his eyes. "Not the title, not the wealth, just me. I wanted to earn your love honestly, through my own merit. So I disguised myself, presented myself as someone ordinary, and hoped you might come to care for the man I am, rather than the Duke I happened to be born." Catherine stood abruptly, backing away from him. You lied to me. Every day, every conversation, every moment we shared was built on deception. The feelings were real, Albert insisted, desperate. Everything I felt, everything I said about loving you, that was truth. Only the circumstances were false. Only the circumstances. Her voice rose, pain and anger mixing. You let me fall in love with someone who doesn't exist. Albert Hayes, the poor laborer, the honest man seeking work. He was fiction. Everything I thought I knew about you was a performance. No. Albert moved toward her, but she stepped back. The man who worked beside you, who laughed with you, who proposed because he couldn't imagine life without you, that was real. That is me, Catherine. The title is just an accident of birth. The man you fell in love with exists. Stop. She held up a hand, tears streaming down her face. I need time to think. I need you to leave. Catherine, please. Her voice broke. We're married now, bound legally, and I understand I have no choice in that. But right now I cannot bear to look at you. Please go. Albert felt his world crumbling, but he couldn't force her to listen. He looked at William, at Matthew and James, seeing betrayal in all their faces. I never meant to hurt any of you. I'll return tomorrow, and we can discuss what happens next. But know this. My offer to help with your debts stands, regardless of Catherine's feelings. That debt forgiveness comes with no conditions, no expectations. It's what should have been done years ago. He left, walking into the gathering darkness, feeling more alone than he had in his entire privileged life. Behind him, he heard Catherine's sobs, each one a knife to his heart. He had gambled everything on love and deception, and now he was losing both the woman he adored and the man he'd discovered himself to be. The cottage on the far edge of his land felt cavernous despite its small size. Thomas arrived within the hour, having been watching from a distance as instructed. It went poorly, the old servant observed. Catastrophically. Albert collapsed into a chair. She hates me, Thomas, and I deserve it. Perhaps, but you also love her genuinely, and that counts for something. Does it? I manipulated her feelings through false pretenses. What kind of love builds a foundation on lies? Thomas poured them both brandy. The kind that tests whether the foundation can be rebuilt on truth. You made a terrible choice, Your Grace, but your motivation wasn't entirely selfish. You wanted to know if you could be loved for yourself. And now I'll never know because she can't separate the man from the deception. Albert drank, the expensive liquor tasting like ash. I've ruined everything. The night passed in misery. Albert didn't sleep, tormented by images of Catherine's face when she learned the truth, the devastation in her eyes. He had hurt the person he loved most, and no amount of wealth or position could fix that damage. Morning brought an unexpected visitor. William Belrose appeared at the cottage door, his expression grave but not hostile. May I come in? Albert stepped aside, grateful for any contact, even if it came bearing more condemnation. William settled into a chair, studying the young duke with eyes that had seen much of life's complications. My daughter spent the night crying, William said bluntly. I held her while she sobbed, while she raged against you, and against herself for being foolish enough to trust. Each word landed like a blow, but Albert endured them. I know sorry isn't enough. Nothing I say can undo the hurt I've caused. No, it can't, William paused. But I'm not here to berate you. I'm here because, despite everything, I believe you do love her. I watched you these past months. I saw how you looked at my daughter, how you worked yourself to exhaustion trying to help us. That wasn't performance. It was real. Hope flickered dangerously in Albert's chest. What are you saying? I'm saying you made a terrible mistake, but perhaps from understandable reasons. You're a duke who's never known if people value you or your title. That's a lonely position, one I can almost sympathize with, despite the vast difference in our stations. William leaned forward. Catherine is hurt and angry, and she has every right to be. But she's also practical, and she's my daughter. She doesn't give her heart easily or lightly. I don't want her forced into this marriage, Albert said urgently. If she truly cannot forgive me, I'll arrange an annulment. She'll be provided for, your family's debts forgiven, all without obligation or expectation. That's noble, but it misses the point. William smiled slightly. She doesn't want an annulment, Your Grace. She wants the man she fell in love with to be real. She wants to believe that the connection you shared wasn't entirely fabricated. It wasn't. God, it wasn't. Albert's voice cracked. She made me better than I've ever been. Working beside her, talking with her, building a life together, even in that brief time. It showed me what I'd been missing in my privileged existence. I became who I was always meant to be. Then prove it to her, not with grand gestures or ducal authority, but by being that man again. She needs time, yes, but she also needs consistency. Be the Albert Hayes who worked our fields and won her heart, because that's the man she married, title or no title. William stood to leave, placing a weathered hand on Albert's shoulder. Come to the farm tomorrow, not as Duke demanding his marital rights, but as the man asking for a chance to rebuild trust. We'll be discussing what happens next, how this marriage proceeds, and you need to be part of that conversation. After William left, Albert felt the first stirring of hope since the revelation. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but at least one existed. He spent the day preparing himself emotionally for what would be the most important negotiation of his life, not for land or political advantage, but for the heart of the woman he loved. The next day he returned to the Belrose farm as requested. Catherine was there, her eyes red from crying, but her spine straight with determination. The entire family gathered, creating a united front that reminded Albert he wasn't just reconciling with a wife, but integrating into a family he'd deceived. "I've been thinking," Catherine said without preamble, her voice carefully controlled. "About us, about this marriage, about what happens now." Albert waited, hardly breathing. "I'm angry with you. That won't disappear overnight or perhaps ever completely. You took away my choice by building our relationship on false pretenses." She paused, gathering strength. "But I also cannot deny what I felt these past months. The connection we shared, the conversations, the laughter, those were real to me, and I need to believe they were real to you too." "They were," Albert said fervently. "Every moment. Then here's what I propose. You are Duke Benford, and I am now your Duchess, whether we like how we arrived at that state or not. But I won't move to your estate immediately, and I won't play the role of decorative wife who exists to enhance your status. I never wanted that. Good, because here's what I do want." Catherine's eyes blazed with a combination of hurt and determination. "I want you to continue working this farm with us for the next month, living as you were, working as you were, being the man I thought I'd married. During that time we'll share the cottage as husband and wife, but you'll earn my trust back through actions, not words. And after the month? After the month, if I believe the man I fell in love with and the Duke of Benford are truly the same person, we'll move forward together. We'll go to your estate, I'll assume the role of Duchess, and we'll build the life you envisioned. But it will be a partnership, not a performance. I won't be paraded as your prize, or hidden as your shame." Albert felt tears burning his eyes. She was giving him a chance, a genuine opportunity to prove himself. "I accept your terms completely, and the debts will be forgiven regardless," William interjected firmly. "We're not selling our daughter's forgiveness for financial relief. If you clear our debts, it's because it's the right thing to do, not as payment for Catherine's compliance." "Understood." Albert looked at each of them in turn. "I'm grateful for this opportunity." "I know I don't deserve it." "You don't," Catherine agreed. "But I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for me because I need to know if what we had was real or if I was just a fool in love with a fantasy." They established new terms for their unusual arrangement. Albert would return to his cottage each night after working the farm, giving Catherine space she needed. During the day, they would work together, talk together, rebuild what he'd broken through deception. The month would be a test for both of them, for him to prove his sincerity, for her to discover if she could forgive. The first week was agony. Catherine treated him with cool politeness, maintaining distance even as they worked side by side. She spoke only when necessary, her warmth replaced by careful neutrality. Albert endured it, understanding this was his penance, the price of his deception. But gradually, inevitably, the walls began cracking. Her shared joke about a stubborn goat brought a reluctant smile. Working together to repair a broken wagon wheel reminded them of their easy partnership. Small moments of genuine connection broke through Catherine's defenses, despite her determination to remain guarded. By the second week, they were talking more freely. Catherine asked questions about his real life, the estate, his childhood. Albert answered honestly, holding nothing back, letting her see both the privilege and the loneliness that had shaped him. She told him about her fears regarding their vastly different worlds, her concern that she would never fit into his life as Duchess. "You already fit," Albert insisted during one of these conversations, "not into the role society expects, but into my heart, into the life I want to build. I don't need a duchess who knows which fork to use at state dinners. I need a partner who challenges me to be better, who reminds me what matters beyond titles and property." "Pretty words," Catherine said, but her tone had softened. "But words are easy. Actions prove truth." So Albert focused on actions. He worked harder than ever, showed up consistently, listened more than he spoke. When Catherine struggled with fear about the future, he provided reassurance without dismissing her concerns. When she needed space, he gave it without complaint. Slowly, painfully, trust began rebuilding. The turning point came during the third week. A storm damaged part of the cottage roof, and they worked together to repair it before rain could cause further harm. Perched on a ladder, passing materials back and forth, they fell into the easy rhythm they'd developed during his time as a laborer. Catherine laughed at something he said, and suddenly they were both laughing, genuinely and freely, the way they had before everything changed. That evening, Catherine invited him to stay, rather than returning to his cottage. They sat by the fire in the small dwelling that was now legally their shared home, and she took his hand for the first time since their wedding. "I think I'm ready to believe you," she said quietly. "Ready to believe that the man I fell in love with is real, that he exists whether he's wearing rough clothes or ducal robes." Albert brought her hand to his lips. "He is real, Catherine. You made him real by seeing past everything else to the person underneath. I was living a half-life before I met you, going through motions without meaning. You woke me up." She moved closer, resting her head on his shoulder. "I'm still scared. Your world is so different from mine. What if I fail as Duchess? What if I embarrass you or disappoint everyone?" "You could never disappoint me. And anyone who can manage this farm, who can work from dawn to dusk and still have energy for kindness, can handle anything society throws at her." He stroked her hair gently. "Besides, I'm changing how things work. The Duke of Benfort will be different because of you. More engaged with his people, more concerned with justice than tradition." They sat in comfortable silence, watching flames dance in the hearth. The month wasn't quite over, but they both knew the test had been passed. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The final week of their month-long trial period brought a new development. Representatives from Albert's estate arrived, bearing news that required the Duke's immediate attention. Thomas greeted Albert privately, his relief evident. "The estate needs you, Your Grace. Decisions have been delayed too long in your absence." "I'll return," Albert said, "but not alone. Catherine and I will come together, as we should have from the beginning." He explained the situation to Catherine and her family. The time had come to transition to his real life, to bring her into his world fully. Catherine agreed, though he could see nervousness in her eyes. "We'll do this properly," Albert assured her. "No more deceptions, no more hiding. I want everyone to know exactly who you are and how much you mean to me." Before they left, true to his word, Albert formally forgave all Belrose family debts and transferred additional funds to ensure their security. He offered William and his sons positions on the estate if they wanted them, but understood when they chose to remain on their farm, now free from the burden that had weighed on them for years. "Take care of my daughter," William said, embracing Albert. "She's stronger than she looks, but she'll need your support in that world of yours." "She has it," Albert promised, always. The journey to Benfort Estate took most of a day. Catherine sat beside Albert in a carriage far more luxurious than anything she'd experienced, watching the landscape change from familiar fields to manicured grounds that spoke of immense wealth. When the main house came into view, a massive structure of stone and glass, she gasped. "You live here?" "We live here," Albert corrected gently. "This is our home now." The staff lined up to greet them, their faces showing barely concealed shock at their duke's choice of bride. Catherine, in her simple dress with work-roughened hands, looked utterly unlike the sophisticated ladies they had expected. Albert watched several servants exchange glances, saw the judgments forming. He cut through it immediately. "This is Catherine Benford, Duchess of Benford, and she will be treated with the respect and honor due to her position. Anyone unable to do so may seek employment elsewhere." His tone left no room for argument. Thomas stepped forward, bowing respectfully to Catherine. "Welcome home, Your Grace. We are honored by your presence." Catherine looked overwhelmed, but managed to return the greeting. Albert guided her inside, showing her the home that was now theirs to share. He could see her taking in the opulence, comparing it to the cottage she'd left behind, processing the vast gulf between their backgrounds. In their private chambers that evening, she finally broke down. "I don't belong here, Albert. Look at this place. Look at me. I'm a farmer's daughter who doesn't know the first thing about being a duchess." He held her close. "You belong wherever I am, because you're my wife and my partner. As for knowing how to be a duchess, there's no single way to fill that role. You'll create your own version, one that honors both your background and your position. What if I fail? Then we'll fail together and start again." He tilted her face up to meet his eyes. "Catherine, I didn't marry you to gain a duchess. I married you because you're the only person who's ever made me feel truly alive. Everything else is just details we'll figure out as we go." She kissed him then, truly kissed him for the first time since their wedding day. The kiss held forgiveness and promise, fear and hope, the complex mixture of emotions that defined their unusual journey to this moment. As they finally consummated their marriage that night, the deception that had brought them together felt like ancient history. What mattered was the truth they had discovered, that love transcended station, that honesty could be rebuilt after betrayal, and that two people from impossibly different worlds could create something genuine together. The next morning, Albert woke with Catherine in his arms, in the ducal chambers that were now their shared sanctuary. He had everything he dared to hope for, a wife he loved truly, a chance to be the man he wanted to be, and a future built on truth rather than pretense. But he knew challenges lay ahead. Catherine would need support as she learned her new role. Society would gossip and judge. The transition from farm cottage to ducal estate wouldn't be seamless. Yet as he looked at his sleeping wife, her face peaceful in the morning light, Albert felt confident they could handle whatever came. They had already survived the hardest test, the revelation of his deception and the rebuilding of trust. Everything else would be easier by comparison, or so he hoped as their story moved into its final chapter. The first weeks at Benford Estate tested Catherine in ways she had never imagined. She woke each morning in a bed larger than the entire room she'd grown up in, surrounded by silk and velvet that felt foreign against her work-roughened skin. Servants anticipated her every need before she could voice it, which somehow made her feel more helpless rather than cared for. The elaborate rituals of aristocratic life, the formal dinners, the calling cards, the intricate rules governing every social interaction seemed designed to highlight how little she belonged. Albert did his best to ease the transition. He spent mornings teaching her about estate management, showing her account books and property maps, explaining the responsibilities that came with their position. Afternoons brought etiquette lessons from a patient instructor he'd hired, a kindly older woman named Mrs. Pemberton, who had served as governess to several noble families. Evenings they reserved for themselves, dining privately and talking about the day's challenges. But despite these supports, Catherine struggled. The other noble ladies who came calling looked at her with barely concealed disdain, their polite smiles not quite masking their judgment. She could read their thoughts in every raised eyebrow and exchanged glance. Farmer's daughter, unsuitable match, fortune hunter who'd somehow trapped a duke. Their conversations referenced people and events she knew nothing about, leaving her silent and feeling ignorant. The servants were even more challenging. While they obeyed her direct orders, she sensed their reluctance, their belief that she was playing a role she had no right to. The housekeeper, Mrs. Blackwood, was particularly difficult, subtly undermining Catherine's attempts to establish herself by deferring every decision to how the previous Duchess would have preferred it. 2 weeks into her new life, Catherine broke down completely. She'd spent the afternoon enduring tea with several noble ladies, whose conversation consisted entirely of gossip about people she'd never met. Their thinly veiled insults about new blood and questionable backgrounds had landed like blows. When they finally left, she fled to the gardens, finding a secluded bench where she could cry without witnesses. That's where Albert found her, her face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking with sobs. He sat beside her without speaking, simply pulling her into his arms and letting her release the accumulated pain and frustration. "I can't do this," she finally gasped. "I've tried, Albert, I truly have. But I don't belong in this world. Every day I feel more like an imposter, someone playing dress-up in clothes that don't fit." "Tell me what happened." His voice was gentle, but carried an edge that suggested consequences for whoever had hurt his wife. Catherine recounted the afternoon, the cutting remarks disguised as pleasantries, the way the women had made her feel small and inadequate. Albert's jaw tightened as she spoke, anger building beneath his calm exterior. "Those women are petty and cruel," he said when she finished. "Their opinions matter nothing to me and should matter nothing to you. But they're right, aren't they? I don't know how to be what you need. I can't discuss politics or literature the way they do. I don't know which fork to use at formal dinners. I'm just a farmer's daughter pretending to be something I'm not." Albert took her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You are not pretending. You are my wife, my duchess, and you belong here because I chose you, not despite your background, but because of who you are, strong, honest, kind, and real, in ways those women will never understand." "But no," his tone was firm. "Listen to me, Catherine. I spent my entire life surrounded by people like those women. They're educated in all the right subjects, trained in all the proper etiquette, and utterly hollow at their core. They've never worked a day in their lives, never sacrificed for anyone, never known real hardship or genuine connection. You have more worth in your smallest finger than they have in their entire perfumed, corseted bodies." Despite her tears, Catherine felt a small smile forming. "That's rather harsh. It's the truth. And here's what we're going to do. You will no longer force yourself to fit their mold. Instead, you're going to show them what a real duchess looks like, one who cares about the people on these lands, who understands their struggles because she's lived them, who brings actual substance to a role that's too often just ceremony." Over the following days, Albert helped Catherine reimagine her position. Instead of trying to master the superficial accomplishments of noble ladies, she focused on meaningful work. She began visiting tenant farms, talking with the families who worked Benfort land. Her background became an asset rather than a liability, allowing her to understand their needs and concerns in ways no previous duchess had. She discovered families struggling with unfair rents, children without access to education, women dying in childbirth because they couldn't afford medical care. Each discovery ignited her passion for justice, the same fire that had driven her to work alongside her family, despite their poverty. She brought these issues to Albert, and together they began implementing changes. Rents were adjusted to fair levels. A school was established in the village, free for all children. Catherine hired a midwife and arranged for regular medical visits to the farms. She started a cooperative where tenant families could sell their goods collectively, getting better prices than they could achieve individually. Her days filled with purpose, and the hollow feeling of being decorative and useless disappeared. The transformation didn't go unnoticed. The same noble ladies who had mocked her began to see results they couldn't dismiss. Tenant families spoke of the Duchess with genuine affection and gratitude. Estate productivity increased because workers felt valued rather than exploited. Other nobles, seeing the positive changes, began asking Albert about his methods. Catherine found unexpected allies too. Several younger noble wives, tired of the empty social rituals, approached her privately. They wanted to learn to do something meaningful with their positions and resources. Catherine welcomed them, creating a small network of women who met regularly to discuss social improvement projects rather than gossip. Mrs. Pemberton became a true friend rather than just an instructor. The older woman admired Catherine's determination and helped her navigate social situations without compromising her values. "You don't need to become like them," she told Catherine one afternoon. "You need to show them there's a better way to be." The real challenge came 3 months into Catherine's tenure as Duchess, when Albert's uncle, Lord Reginald Benfort, arrived from London. Reginald was a powerful figure in Parliament and the extended Benfort family, known for his conservative views and fierce protection of aristocratic traditions. He'd heard about Albert's unsuitable marriage and had come to assess the damage to the family reputation. Albert warned Catherine in advance. "He's going to be difficult. Uncle Reginald believes bloodlines and breeding are everything. But remember, you're my wife, my choice, and no one, not even family, gets to diminish that." The first dinner with Reginald was excruciating. The older man subjected Catherine to a barrage of questions designed to expose her inadequacies. What languages did she speak? What musical instruments could she play? Which noble families was she connected to? Each negative answer brought a small, satisfied smile to his lips, as if she were confirming his worst assumptions. Catherine endured it until dessert, when Reginald made a particularly cutting remark about the degradation of noble lines through inferior breeding. Something inside her snapped. She had been trying to be diplomatic, to represent Albert well, but she would not sit silently while being insulted. "Lord Reginald," she said, her voice calm but carrying steel, "I cannot claim noble ancestry or expensive education. I grew up working fields, not attending balls, but I can claim something perhaps more valuable, understanding of the people who actually sustain estates like this, the farmers and labourers whose work generates the wealth that funds your comfortable life in London." Reginald's eyebrows rose. "Are you lecturing me, girl?" "I'm offering perspective." Catherine met his gaze steadily. "Since becoming Duchess, I visited every tenant farm on Benfort land. I've seen families struggling with debts that should have been forgiven years ago, children going without education, people dying from treatable illnesses because they lack access to care. These aren't just numbers in an account book. They're human beings, whose labour supports our privilege. The lower classes have always struggled. It's the natural order." "Is it?" Catherine leaned forward. "Or is it the result of choices made by people in power? Albert and I have started making different choices. We've reduced rents to fair levels, established a school, provided medical access, and the result? Productivity has increased, tenant loyalty is higher, and the estate is more profitable than it's been in years. Justice and prosperity aren't mutually exclusive." The room fell silent. Albert watched his wife with undisguised pride, while Reginald processed being challenged by someone he'd expected to intimidate easily. The older man studied Catherine with new interest, seeing past the humble origins to the sharp mind and strong will beneath. "You're not what I expected," Reginald said finally. "I rarely am." Catherine allowed herself a small smile. "But I am what Albert needs, a partner who challenges him to be better, who reminds him that titles come with responsibilities beyond maintaining social status." To everyone's surprise, Reginald laughed. "Well, nephew, you've certainly found someone with spirit. Perhaps not the conventional choice, but I'm beginning to see why you made it." The tension diffused, and the conversation shifted to estate management. Reginald, for all his snobbery, was a practical man who respected results. As Catherine detailed the changes they'd implemented and the positive outcomes, he listened with genuine interest. By the end of the evening, while he hadn't completely abandoned his reservations, he'd gained grudging respect for his nephew's unorthodox duchess. Before departing the next day, Reginald pulled Catherine aside. "I came here expecting to find a disaster, some grasping commoner who'd tricked my nephew into an unsuitable marriage. Instead, I found a woman with more substance than most noble ladies I know. You'll face opposition, especially in London society, but you have allies now. I'll ensure the family supports you." His endorsement opened doors. When other noble families heard that even the conservative Lord Reginald approved of the new Duchess, their attitudes shifted. Invitations began arriving, requests for Catherine to speak about her social improvement projects, opportunities to influence beyond Benfort estate. But Catherine's greatest triumph came 6 months into her marriage, when she successfully negotiated with Parliament for legislation protecting tenant farmers from exploitative practices. She'd spent weeks in London, working with sympathetic members of Parliament, using her own experience to illustrate the human cost of current policies. Albert stood beside her throughout, but let her take the lead, understanding that this was her fight, her passion. When the legislation passed, it became known informally as the Benford Act, though everyone understood it was Catherine's achievement. Farmers across England gained protections they'd lacked for centuries, and Catherine became a symbol of how women could wield influence beyond traditional feminine spheres. Through it all, her marriage to Albert deepened. They'd started from a foundation of deception, nearly collapsed under the weight of revealed lies, and rebuilt something stronger than what they'd lost. They worked as true partners now, consulting each other on estate decisions, supporting each other's initiatives, balancing Albert's strategic thinking with Catherine's passionate advocacy. The physical aspect of their marriage flourished too. The initial awkwardness gave way to genuine intimacy, connection that went beyond bodies to souls. They learned each other's rhythms, preferences, vulnerabilities. Albert discovered that Catherine was strongest when she felt most challenged, that she needed purpose and struggled to thrive. Catherine learned that Albert's aristocratic reserve hid deep wells of emotion, that he needed her to draw out the warmth he kept carefully guarded. One evening, nearly a year after their marriage, they sat together in the private sitting room that had become their sanctuary. Catherine was reviewing proposals for a new hospital in the village, while Albert worked on correspondence. The comfortable silence between them spoke of companionship that didn't require constant conversation. "Do you ever regret it?" Catherine asked suddenly, setting aside her papers. Albert looked up. "Regret what?" "All of this. Choosing me instead of an appropriate noble wife. You could have had someone who fit seamlessly into your world, who brought political alliances and social connections, instead of complications and controversy." He set down his pen and moved to sit beside her. "Never. Not for a single moment. Even when I embarrass you in front of other nobles with my blunt speech. Especially then." He took her hand. "You make me proud, Catherine. Proud of your courage, your compassion, your refusal to pretend. You've made me a better man and a better duke. Any embarrassment is worth that. I was so angry when I learned the truth about who you were," she said softly. "I felt betrayed and manipulated, but now I understand why you did it. You needed to know you were valued for yourself, not your title. I needed the same thing, to be certain you chose me for who I am, not what you imagined I could become." "And are you certain now?" She smiled. "Completely. You love the woman who carries water buckets and argues with Parliament members. You love the real me, farmer's daughter and duchess both. I love every part of you." He kissed her gently, "even the parts that terrify London society." They laughed together, comfortable in the life they'd built from such unconventional beginnings. Outside, the estate grounds stretched in manicured beauty, representing centuries of Benford heritage. But inside these walls, something new was growing. A partnership built on truth, a love that transcended class, a legacy that would reshape what it meant to be noble. Catherine's family visited regularly, no longer burdened by debt, welcomed as honored guests rather than awkward reminders of her background. William watched his daughter with pride, seeing how she'd adapted without losing herself. Matthew and James joked with their brother-in-law, the Duke, relationships uncomplicated by the vast difference in their stations. The estate prospered under Albert and Catherine's joint management. Tenants worked harder for landlords who treated them fairly, productivity increased, and the Benford name became associated with justice rather than just privilege. Other estates began emulating their methods, creating a ripple effect of positive change. But the most significant transformation was personal. Albert had found the genuine connection he'd craved his entire life, the assurance that he was loved for himself rather than his title. Catherine had discovered that she could honor her roots while embracing her new position, that being a duchess didn't require abandoning her values or her identity. Their story became legend in the region, whispered by servants and celebrated by tenants. The Duke who'd disguised himself to win true love, the farmer's daughter who'd become a duchess, and changed aristocratic society from within. Young couples saw their example and dared to imagine that love could transcend social boundaries. On their first anniversary, Albert took Catherine back to the small cottage where they'd lived briefly as newlyweds. The Belrose family had maintained it carefully, and it stood as a reminder of where they'd begun. They walked through the modest rooms, remembering those complicated days of rebuilding trust. "If you could go back," Albert asked, "knowing everything that would happen, would you still say yes when I proposed as Albert Hayes?" Catherine considered carefully. "Yes, but I'd probably punch you first when you revealed the truth." He laughed. "I would have deserved it." "You would have." She turned to face him. "But I'm grateful for the journey, even the painful parts. We wouldn't be who we are now without them. You wouldn't have learned to be vulnerable, and I wouldn't have learned to be strong in ways I never imagined." They stood in the cottage that represented both their beginning and their foundation. Two people from impossible different worlds who had somehow created something beautiful together. The Duke and the farmer's daughter, the nobleman and the commoner, the man who'd needed to disguise himself to find love, and the woman who'd taught him what love truly meant. As the sun set over the valley where they'd first met, Catherine leaned against Albert, feeling his arms wrap around her with the familiar comfort of genuine affection. Their story had begun with deception, survived revelation, and blossomed into truth. It wasn't the conventional fairy tale, but it was real, and that made it better than any fantasy. They returned to the estate as evening fell, to the grand house that was now truly home because they'd made it so together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that love could transform not just individuals, but entire systems of power and privilege. But tonight, they had each other, and that was enough. The Duke and Duchess of Benfort, improbable partners, genuine lovers, and proof that the best love stories are the ones built on truth, written one choice at a time by two people brave enough to risk everything for something real. Their legacy would extend far beyond their lifetime, inspiring generations to come, demonstrating that titles matter less than character, that breeding matters less than kindness, and that the deepest love grows not from perfect circumstances, but from imperfect people choosing each other again and again, despite every reason to give up. And so our story ends where it truly began, not with a duke seeking love or a farmer's daughter dreaming of more, but with two souls recognizing each other across impossible distance, refusing to accept the limitations society imposed, and creating their own definition of happily ever after. Dear listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this journey with Albert and Catherine. Their story reminds us that true love requires courage, honesty, and the willingness to fight for what matters most. If this story touched your heart, we would be so grateful if you would subscribe to Echoes of Romance, leave us a comment sharing your thoughts, give this story a like and activate your notifications so you never miss our next tale. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue bringing you these stories of love, courage, and hope. Until next time, may your own love story be filled with truth, passion, and the kind of connection that transforms everything.